Chapter 6. A Familiar Face. Back at the hotel, sipping tea beside the brick fireplace of their suite, the men traded accounts of their interviews as Eva readied herself for supper in her room down the hall. Conan Doyle was quite impressed with Houdini's conversation with the old caretaker.
"Houdini, after that singular exchange, even you can't seriously believe there's nothing supernatural at work in all this. You must concede that psychic forces are involved, even if a living human agent is behind them."
"Well, maybe," the magician acknowledged. "But you do know that these country folks, especially the colored ones, are superstitious. Half of what that caretaker said he must have gotten second or third hand. Some could be exaggerated. You should have seen this guy with his eyes bugging out and all this yes massa stuff. I swear it was like watching a minstrel show. One of my neighbors in Harlem would clean his clock for that performance."
"Granted, civility does not inspire admiration, but we cannot dismiss out of hand what a man has witnessed merely because obsequiousness offends us. You promise to keep an open mind."
Before Houdini could reply, a knock came at the door.
"Eva dressed finely,"
Sir Arthur said, rising to open it.
"What takes the distaff half of our species so stupendously long to choose their attire, I shall never understand."
"The question is, who's she dolling herself up for, you or me?"
"Shame on you, Houdini,"
Conan Doyle said with a smile, putting a finger to his lips.
"Not every attractive divorcee is a barracuda."
Conan Doyle flung open the door, and in strode a tall, rail-thin man in a long gray cape and deerstalker hat, grinning broadly. The hawk-faced nose, the piercing black eyes, darting about and assessing the room, there was no mistaking who stood before them.
"Sherlock Holmes! Well, this is a welcome surprise," Conan Doyle shouted in delight. "My son returns to me, a prodigal one, but a sight for sore eyes nevertheless."
The famous man took off his cap and tossed it onto a rack by the door. "Yes, but you haven't been half as sporting to me as the fellow in the Bible, have you? As I recall, you tossed me off a waterfall once."
"Yet you're none the worse for wear."
Conan Doyle chuckled genially and gave the other's hand a robust shake.
"I fear it was either you or me. If I hadn't bumped you off, I'd have taken a spoonful of strychnine myself to preserve my sanity."
Houdini, jumping to his feet, rushed over to greet the legend, who produced from his coat pocket an oversized magnifying glass and peered through it at the magician as if inspecting some rare tropical insect. "You, sir, I would deduce are a performer of some kind, and a jolly good one," the guest observed. Houdini bowed. "Very astute, Mr. Gillette." "Elementary, my dear Houdini," said the actor, shaking his hand. William Gillette had played Holmes over 1,000 times on stages around the world. His aquiline profile would be forever etched in the public's consciousness as the face of that eccentric master of deduction. He was given to dressing the part in public from time to time. Like many a star, he simply couldn't get enough attention. "I saw your performance of A Study in Scarlet in New York," Houdini exclaimed. "It was a cat's pajamas. You make poor Barrymore look like an amateur." Sir Arthur had been hesitant to adapt Sherlock Holmes to the stage, fearing that his cerebral hero's pontification and elaborate chains of reasoning would make him an intolerable bore. But the lure of a colossal check had been irresistible, and it turned out audiences were ecstatic to see Holmes and Watson in the flesh.
"To what do we owe the pleasure of your company?"
"Well, I'm here for the séance tonight, of course. Eve invited me, as I was doing Richard III at the Stonewall Theatre in Richmond. Of course, I wouldn't miss it for the world."
"Absolutely splendid, old boy,"
Conan Doyle rejoiced. Houdini grimaced. "Will there be any other celebrities in attendance, Sir Arthur?" he said quietly through gritted teeth. "Perhaps Calvin Coolidge. I understand the vice president's wife is crazy about ghosts. Or maybe Oliver Wendell Holmes?" Holmes was one of Conan Doyle's idols. He'd even named his detective after the great American poet. It was one of his big disappointments in life that he'd never got to meet the writer of such memorable pieces as The Chambered Nautilus.
"You know, of course, that Holmes died in '94, he said icily.
"Yes, but why should that keep him from this little soiree?" the magician said. Gillette laughed uneasily. "And the American team scores a goal."
"It escapes me why the demise of a great man should be cause for merriment."
Eva entered through the open door in time to hear the rumblings of discontent. "Forgive me if I've committed a faux pas. It's just that I knew Mr. Gillette and Sir Arthur were friends. I hoped you'd be pleasantly surprised."
"Indeed I am, madam. But pray tell us, who else is coming?"
"Well, of course, Mrs. Marion Hyde from the Worcestershire Psychical Society. She'll be accompanied by her husband, James Hyde, a banker and president of the Chamber of Commerce. She invited the Reverend Albert Lassiter, a preacher at the First Baptist Church." "You got a Baptist preacher to go along with this?" Houdini said in surprise. "He has an open mind," Eva said, then added pointedly, "he considers it a virtue." Chapter 6 Continued. They assembled at the Langdon house just before sunset. Reverend Lassiter was kind enough to supply chairs and a large folding table from his church, which he and Houdini set up with Gillette's help. The Hydes were clearly enamored by Sir Arthur and peppered him with questions about psychic phenomena, from thought transference to telekinesis. Reverend Lassiter was more in awe of Houdini, whom he pressed unsuccessfully for the secrets behind his mysteries. Gillette was ticked off that the couple failed to recognize him by name, a name that had adorned so many theater marquees in decades past, without further introduction. Not decked out in the deerstalker cap and cape, the actor attracted little notice and began to sulk as he realized that a mere magician was getting more attention than he, the rightful heir to Sir Henry Irving, and certainly superior to Barrymore, who was emerging as successor as Holmes to the aging Gillette. Sir Arthur noticed his friend's sour demeanor and came to the rescue, bringing over the Hydes.
"It's thanks to Gillette here that many of your countrymen ever heard of Sherlock Holmes,"
he said buoyantly, placing a hand on the actor's shoulder.
"He makes my hero of the printed page seem very anemic by comparison."
Gillette waved his hands. "Sheer nonsense. But do go on." The couple laughed. Reverend Lassiter, a long-faced man with the stern look of a 17th-century Puritan preacher, turned to Sir Arthur. "Some of my colleagues, as you know, condemn this spiritualism as a form of idolatry. I consider myself more liberal in my views and wish to see it in action firsthand. It does, though, make me uncomfortable that you insist on calling it a religion. Are you not a member of any church?" Sir Arthur smiled. He was quite prepared for this line of questioning.
"I was raised a Roman Catholic. As a young man, I came to see most of the teachings as superstition, and I switched my allegiance to science. But I've always been driven by a need to follow the truth wherever it leads me. It has led me here." He gestured to the ballroom, where a table encircled by chairs had been made ready for the séance. "I see," the clergyman replied. "I, too, want to know the truth. If we can truly make contact with our loved ones on the other side and prove the immortality of the soul, well, who could argue that that is not a wondrous thing?"
"Precisely," said the author. "I do have one concern about the proceedings." Noting Reverend Lassiter's discomfort, the author said,
"Will you excuse us for a moment, Gillette? I think the Hydes could use a good story about the theatre. Perhaps that colourful anecdote about Sarah Bernhardt and the French poodle."
When the actor was some distance away, Reverend Lassiter whispered to Conan Doyle confidentially, "I've heard that the young lady sometimes conducts her readings in the altogether. She won't, well, disrobe, will she?" Sir Arthur reassured him.
"Mrs. C. shall maintain all proper decorum. She fully understands the gravity of this matter, and is as committed to getting to the bottom of it as Houdini and myself."
Was it his imagination, or did the preacher look a trifle disappointed? The light from the windows was beginning to fade. Houdini placed a large candelabra, borrowed from the hotel in Dunwood, at the center of the table and lit it. A moment later, Eva entered the room arm in arm with a pot-bellied, middle-aged man with bushy red eyebrows and a most spectacular red beard. "This is Mr. Noah Bancroft from the Richmond Courier and Gazette," she announced.
"I hate to intrude," the newcomer said in a deep, rumbling drawl, "but when I heard that two of the most celebrated men in the country were both in the state, I hopped on the first train. I hope to interview you about your life's work, but this sounds one heck of a lot more interesting. Would you mind if I joined y'all?"
"Certainly not," Eva said. "I believe 7 in addition to medium is an ideal number for what we're about to undertake. In a few moments the sun will set, and the spiritual forces will be at their greatest strength. Then we can begin." The participants took their seats.
"I did a little research on this house in our archives," the newspaper man revealed. "The Algonquin Indians had a name for this area. They called it the Macadiwa, which means the Black. According to their legends, it was a kind of a shadow land, a halfway point between the spirit world and the ordinary world."
"Charming," said Gillette. "Just the sort of place one wishes to find oneself after sunset."
"Extraordinary," Conan Doyle declared. "This cast a whole new light on the matter. Good show, Bancroft."
He took an instant liking to the man who, with his full red beard and energetic manner, looked uncannily like Professor Challenger, or the author's equally florid medical school chum, Dr. George Budd, upon whom he modeled the maverick scientist.
"I also found out what became of the Frenchie who managed it," the reporter went on. "Died in the Great War at Verdun. I found a story about a traveling salesman who checked into the house and was never seen again. And there was a young fellow named Donald Langdon and a girl named Daisy Holcomb who visited the house for some reason 10 years ago and were never seen again. Others, maybe a dozen in all, before Parker."
Sir Arthur jotted this down in his notebook.
"Immensely helpful. We are indebted to you, sir."
They sat at the table, waiting for the sun to set. Houdini, checking his pocket watch, reckoned this would be in roughly 10 minutes.
"I don't mean to ruffle your feathers, Mr. Doyle, seeing as I know that spiritualism is more or less a religion to you. But I have to admit I'm a skeptic," Bancroft said. "Not a bit offended, old man," Sir Arthur laughed. "For years I was an absolute materialist myself. Believe me, in the medical profession it goes with the territory. I was entirely convinced that thoughts were merely excretions of the brain, as surely as bile is an excretion of the liver. Now I know that the brain is an imperfect vessel for the spirit, and that when it ceases to be, the spirit lives on. It is not unlike a violinist whose violin is destroyed. The instrument is shattered to bits, yet the musician remains."
The newspaper man shook his head dubiously.
"Still, I can't see how a man who makes up a character as logical as Sherlock Holmes could turn around and believe in ghosts."
Now Sir Arthur became solemn, and his deep voice with the Scottish brogue became as powerful as if he were delivering a sermon.
"Mr. Bancroft, with the aid of mediums, I have seen my departed mother and my brother Innes as plainly as I ever saw them in life. So plainly I could have counted the wrinkles on one and the freckles on the other. I have seen my son Kingsley as surely as I see you now. It was his unmistakable voice, which the medium had never heard. I have clasped the icy hands of spirits. I have smelled the peculiar ozone-like smell of ectoplasm.
I have listened to prophecies which were soon afterward fulfilled. I have read notebooks written in the hand of my own wife, full of information utterly beyond her ken. If a man can see, hear, and feel all this, and yet remain unconvinced of unseen forces, well, he would have to be mad." "Hear, hear!" exclaimed Mrs. Hyde, and her husband dutifully applauded.
"And yet," Bancroft said, turning Houdini, "you go around exposing mediums as frauds, left and right. Do you think the creator of the world's greatest detective is naive?"
Bancroft had his notebook out, and Houdini realized whatever he said was for publication.
"Well," he began uncomfortably. "Oh, he thinks I'm more Dr. Watson than Holmes, and I admit I look the part," Sir Arthur said with a hearty laugh. "And he's not alone in believing I suffer from prelapsarian naivety, as Shaw called it."
Bancroft said, puzzled and struggling over the spelling. "Before the great lapse, the fall of man," Reverend Lassiter whispered. "As naive as Adam, he means." Houdini shook his head. "I have the greatest admiration for Sir Arthur. He's brilliant. But I have found that the more brains a man has, and the better educated he is, the easier it is to pull the wool over his eyes."
Conan Doyle looked amused. "To be sure, Houdini has done splendid work exposing scoundrels. But these investigations have to be approached not in the spirit of a detective grilling a suspect, but of a humble, religious soul seeking enlightenment. I fear my dear friend Houdini has a habit of delving into these matters like a terrier in pursuit of a rat." "And this scares the ghosts away?" Bancroft said, looking somewhat amused. "It can upset the delicate balance, the mental harmony needed for psychic contact with the other realm."
Reverend Lassiter turned to the magician. "I gather, then, that you consider yourself a non-believer. Do you not accept the existence of God in heaven?" "Of course I believe in a supreme being. My dear departed father was a rabbi from a long line of rabbis. But I don't necessarily believe that the creator of Mount Everest would stoop to something so profane as ectoplasm. When I was starting out in show business, my wife Bess and I did a mind-reading act and a medium show. All flim-flammery, of course. One night it dawned on me that we were trifling with people's beliefs in something sacred. We swore off medium shows on the spot. As he delivered the monologue, Houdini gave Eva a piercing gaze, which she met unblinkingly. "I'm not a cynic, Mr. Bancroft, but, like Sir Arthur, a seeker after the truth. I ardently want to believe, if I can find a medium, one who doesn't resort to tricks when the supposed power doesn't arrive. What I wouldn't give to speak to my sainted mother again, or look into her eyes. I've traveled the world for years to unearth mediums so that I could find a true one. I regret to say that so far I haven't witnessed a single one that had a ring of sincerity." "But Mrs. C.," protested Mrs. Hyde. Houdini smiled. "Yes, well, we'll put her powers to the test in a moment, won't we?" Sir Arthur broke in, pointing out,
"Houdini forgets, of course, his own remarkable experience with my wife, Lady Doyle, in which his own mother spoke to him."
"Oh, do tell us about it," said Mrs. Hyde excitedly.
"Well, it was all quite thrilling," the author began.
"Sir Arthur, the time," Houdini protested. "Do go on," Reverend Lassiter pleaded. "We still have a few moments before dusk."
Sir Arthur went on enthusiastically. "One afternoon earlier this year, Houdini sat beside me while my wife, who is adept at automatic writing, received a 15-page letter from his mother. It was an unforgettable scene, my wife's hand flying while she scribbled at a furious rate, me tearing off sheet after sheet and tossing them to him. You could see on his face how moved he became as he read her touching words. To my own beloved boy, how happy I am in this life over here."
Mrs. Hyde took the magician's hand. My dear fellow, how much this must have meant to you. Could you feel her presence?" "I would rather not speak about that very personal matter," Houdini said with a cold smile. Conan Doyle grinned at his friend.
"I imagine he'll write about it soon. Houdini himself is living proof of the supernatural, though he won't admit it."
"I've read about that in one of the Society's journals," said Mr. Hyde, "that you use some kind of teleportation to get out of milk cans and pass through walls." Houdini shook his head. "I've told Sir Arthur time and time again that I rely only on my own skill, strength, and misdirection to achieve my escapes and other mysteries, but he's hard-headed. As brilliant as he is, his skull is cement." Sir Arthur smiled warmly.
"It's my friend who is hard-headed. He refuses to acknowledge that he resorts to preternatural means to achieve his most wonderful escapes, though it is obvious to any intelligent observer. Whether this is because he fears his brother magicians would give him the boot from the profession, or truly has no conscious awareness of his gift, I cannot be sure."
Gillette came away from the window, saying jauntily, "This discussion is scintillating, but the sun has set, and I expect the ghosts are waiting." "Very well, then we may continue," Eva said. "Let us all sit close together."
Chapter 7.
What Lies Beneath?
The next morning, Eva confessed to Conan Doyle, who responded that he was most gravely disappointed. He lectured her like a schoolmaster for close to an hour about the damage she might have done to the spiritualist movement, and she spent the rest of the morning in her room like a chastened child. However, as he breakfasted with Houdini, Sir Arthur was not quite ready to give up the ship. "And yet you say she was not responsible for everything we experienced," he pressed Houdini.
"So she claimed."
Conan Doyle shook his head, befuddled. "The more we dig into this affair, the less we know."
At that moment, a bellhop came to the table. "Mr. Houdini, sir, a package has arrived for you, rush delivery. A very big one." Houdini winked at his companion. "I think all questions are about to be answered. Meet me at the house in an hour. Take Eva's car." When Conan Doyle entered the ballroom, he was astonished to find Houdini on his knees beside a large metal contraption, cylindrical in shape.
"What the devil is that?"
the writer asked in astonishment. He'd heard that Edison was working on a device for communicating with the dead, and he knew that Houdini had connections to Edison's company. Montraville Wood, a scientist who worked for the Wizard of Menlo Park, had invented numerous gadgets for the magician. "It's a gadget some pals of mine in the Navy have been working on," Houdini replied as he rolled up his sleeves and made an adjustment. "It uses sound to find what's under the surface. They owe me one. During the war, I trained our boys to free themselves if the enemy tossed them in water with their hands bound." Lewis Nixon had invented the first such device in 1906 to detect icebergs. During the war, the Allies desperately needed a way to locate German submarines, and by 1918, both Britain and the U.S. had secretly developed elementary systems, known in England as ASDIC sets.
"How does it work?"
asked the older man, as, with some difficulty, he knelt beside Houdini. "The whole thing relies on the piezoelectric properties of quartz," the magician explained. "It projects sound waves, and the echo tells you what's below."
"Extraordinary. During all the campaigning I did before the war, warning about Jerry's U-boats, my friends in the Admiralty haven't breathed a word. You really do keep quite abreast of science, old man."
"You don't know the half of it," Houdini thought, smiling to himself. Houdini, who played an inventor of a sub in Terror Island, was an enthusiastic student of science in real life. His New York townhouse was wired with eavesdropping devices. He baffled visitors who could only assume he used telepathy to know what they'd just said when he was several floors away. You see, it dawned on me that by means of an elevator, an entire room could be made to rise from beneath the ground, he explained to his companion. "This handy gadget will prove I'm right."
"A lift? But there's no electricity."
Not that we can see, but my theory is there's a generator hidden somewhere on the grounds, and with electricity it wouldn't be hard to have a record player that makes spooky sounds either, now would it? Sir Arthur nodded slowly. You may be onto something, old boy. Houdini studied the meters. Nothing. He tapped the machine hopefully. The two men hovered over the device for close to an hour, but the magician's plan bore no fruit. Houdini frowned. Well, don't I look like a horse's ass? Houdini muttered. I would have bet the farm there was something down there. The phantom room. Sir Arthur stood and looked about the empty ballroom, sensing something unfathomably dark and unearthly.
So you concede the phantom room may be preternatural, that it phases in and out of our world?
A room that comes and goes like the Flying Dutchman? Houdini shook his head. It sounds crazy. But at this point, I'm beginning to think it's not out of the realm of possibility.
There can be no doubt that something has fallen over this house like a shroud, Houdini, Sir Arthur said firmly. You and I felt it as soon as we first stepped over the threshold. To combat this evil, we must learn its true nature.
Chapter 8. The Prodigal Son. When Conan Doyle knocked on Eva's door, he found her packing her bags.
Were you going to depart without so much as a goodbye?
I thought I would spare you the embarrassment of a moment more of my company, she replied. The young woman couldn't bear to look her mentor in the eye.
No one has asked you to leave.
Yet I'm quite sure that's what you wish. Sir Arthur bade her sit beside him on a love seat and took her hands.
My dear girl, don't you know it's quite common for mediums such as yourself to resort to cheating when their powers fail them?
Surely you can't find it in your heart to forgive me.
I most certainly can, and do, he said warmly, though you must give me your word of honour there'll be no more such skullduggery from this point on.
Oh, I do, Sir Arthur. I do.
Very well. I have an assignment for you, he informed her with a twinkle in his eyes.
Eva was bewildered by Sir Arthur's renewed faith in her. It was as if the spiritualist movement's chief spokesman had simply forgotten having raked her over the coals a few hours earlier. Moments later, the author returned with a wicker suitcase spilling over with books.
They're from the attic,
Conan Doyle explained. She picked up a leather volume from the top of the pile.
They're very old, some dating back to the 16th century at the very least.
Then they might have been owned by Mrs. Ralston. The cruel mistress of the plantation owner?
Indeed. That's why I want you to go over them with a fine-tooth comb. See if there's anything that sheds a light on the mystery. It'll take a long time, but we need someone on the job who has a good head on her shoulders and an understanding of the preternatural.
Overwhelmed by the gentleman's continued faith in her, she gave him an embrace, which he awkwardly accepted. It was through Sir Arthur's contacts at Harvard that the investigators at last located 32-year-old Paul Langdon, son of George Langdon, the legal owner of the house, and an alumnus of that institution. He now lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, a 6-hour drive away. He was, as Conan Doyle had vaguely recalled, a civil engineer of considerable note. Langdon had designed the 1,600-foot Capstone River Bridge, an achievement that earned him recognition in popular mechanics.
The family lived in that house for more than a decade, Conan Doyle remarked as they reached the outskirts of Charlotte. He must be able to cast some light on whatever it is that plagues the blasted place.
Houdini whistled as they approached a palatial home. The polar opposite of the decrepit relic they were investigating, it radiated joy with the same intensity that the spook house seethed with malignancy. On the other hand, he may have put the old homestead about as far behind him as he could, the magician remarked. Though clearly of modern design, it was reminiscent of a southern plantation, boasting 4 magnificent white columns. The oaken doors would befit a medieval castle, and the butler who took their coats had clearly been trained in England. As they stood in the foyer, marveling at a genuine Rodin, a young, handsome man strode toward them. With exquisite bone structure and wavy fair hair, he'd make a suitable model for a sculptor himself. He shook their hands vigorously in turn. "It's an honor to meet two giants," Paul Langdon declared. "One, the creator of the most memorable character in the history of fiction, and the other, a Superman whose feats are the stuff of legend." He spoke in a languid drawl that brought to Conan Doyle's mind a gentleman of leisure in England. With characteristic modesty, Sir Arthur shook his hand.
"I think Hamlet and Senior Don Quixote might beg to differ with you, Mr. Langdon."
"Paul, please," the young man said as he ushered them in. "I've read about many of your exploits in the newspaper, Mr. Houdini. May I call you Harry?"
"Certainly."
"When we're through talking business, you'll have to show me a trick or two. It would be an honor, though you've caught me unprepared."
"I've seen your bridge in photographs. An extraordinary achievement. Longest suspension bridge in the state, I understand."
"You're too generous."
"In school I fancied I might try my hand at architecture or civil engineering."
"A man of your intellect would have been a credit to our field, though of course a loss to literature," said young Langdon, leading them down a majestic and immensely long hallway.
Conan Doyle laughed. "When I told my teacher I thought of being a civil engineer, he told me, 'You might be an engineer, but not a civil one.'"
A coat of arms hung on a wall outside the living room. The principal shield element was a trio of bears. Sir Arthur couldn't help pausing to look at it. He had a long-standing interest in heralds and genealogy. His mother Mary had drummed into her children her fervent belief that they had aristocratic ancestors, and regaled them with lore of knights in shining armor. She claimed the Doyles were kin to Fulks d'Orlay, a comrade in arms of Richard the Lionhearted. He was rather surprised to see the crest. He didn't think Americans cared a whit about such matters. Paul noticed the author's interest. "The family seat is in Cornwall, and quite ancient, I've been given to understand, going far back before the Norman conquest, back to King Arthur and his crowd. Not quite sure what the bears stand for. I do have some rather hairy uncles." His sardonic manner reminded Sir Arthur of Oscar Wilde, whose extraordinary knack for putting an ironic spin on nearly every phrase dazzled him. Conan Doyle's short stories had appeared together with the notorious Picture of Dorian Gray. He wondered if Langdon shared that unfortunate predilection that led to poor Wilde's ignominious fate, imprisoned along with pickpockets and blackmailers. Conan Doyle had never condemned Wilde, as had some of his fellow writers. To his mind, homosexuality was a form of madness better suited for treatment in a sanitarium than prison. Beside the shield bearing the coat of arms was an enormous painting that depicted a plantation with hundreds of slaves picking cotton and toting bales of it on their heads, while the lord of the manor trotted through his domain on a white steed. "A bygone age of gallant gentlemen," Paul Langdon sighed as the visitors paused at the doorway. "Like the days of knights and damsels in your books about the bowmen, Sir Arthur."
"You've read The White Company?"
Conan Doyle said in open astonishment. "Of course I have. I was positively electrified by the adventures of Sir Nigel and his comrades." Sir Arthur beamed. He had a love-hate relationship with Holmes, who'd made him enormously wealthy, yet caused the public to overlook his historical novels. That genre was taken far more seriously than detective fiction. He was proudest of the meticulously researched White Company. Set during the 100 Years' War, it followed the adventures of a troop of brave and pious bowmen.
"I'm sure Southern gentlemen of that era saw themselves as akin to feudal landlords, with the same sense of chivalry."
"Still, couldn't have been much fun for the poor guys picking the cotton," wisecracked Houdini, whose boyhood idol was Abraham Lincoln. Conan Doyle paled, mortified at what their host would likely consider an insult.
"Well, this is getting off to a jolly good start," he thought.
But the young engineer laughed merrily. "You have a good point there, Harry." He patted the magician on the back. "Well, I suppose you wouldn't have had much trouble escaping if you were a darky." Houdini smiled, but hardly with warmth. Langdon turned to the writer for support. Now, Sir Arthur, I know you've seen darkest Africa with your own eyes, and know how lucky our black-skinned brethren are that we rescued them from heathenism. You wrote all that wonderful material during the Boer War, so you must have seen what the Afrikaners put up with down there. Savage brutes that can only be tamed by the whip. Some people need the firm but kindly hand of a master to be civilized. Long before serving as a volunteer medic and war correspondent in the bruising battle between the British Empire and the South African settlers, Conan Doyle had been ship's surgeon on the Mayumba, which visited the Dark Continent. Besides nearly dying from malaria, he had been shocked by the sight of African women, old and young, with their bosoms exposed, and the captain's tales of savages who sacrificed their own kind to crocodiles filled him with revulsion. And yet, on the same voyage, returning to England, he had shared a conversation with the former slave and abolitionist Henry Highland Garnet, the U.S. consul to Liberia. They chatted at length about literature, and Conan Doyle found him to be better read than himself. That single encounter stuck in his mind ever after.
I've also seen what happened in the Congo, where the King of Belgium subjugated the natives and made them slave laborers on rubber plantations. Massacres, mutilations, dismemberments. My word, there wasn't a grotesque or obscene torture that diseased human ingenuity could invent that was not used against those helpless people. We wouldn't much care for it if foreigners armed to the teeth marched through our countries, would we? It's little wonder the Africans get their pots and seasonings out when they see us coming.
Young Langdon gave a wry smile, all that talk of torture clearly affecting him. Well, I'm fairly certain my forebears didn't dismember anyone.
I'm sorry if I offended you, sir. It's only that I rather suspect every man yearns for freedom, regardless of the color of his skin or his station in life.
Touché, Sir Arthur, and well put. Now, please, come to the drawing-room. They entered a large and well-appointed room, where yet another butler was arranging chairs. The black man snapped to attention. "Sit down, gentlemen," Paul said, settling into a high-backed armchair. "Neb, get these gentlemen some tea."
"Yes, sir."
Sir Arthur began.
"As I said in my telephone call, we are conducting an investigation into the house outside Dunwood, where you lived as a boy. Is there anything at all you can tell us about its history?"
Langdon lit a cigarette and offered the gold case to each of the visitors, who declined. "A bit, yes. It was built in 1852. My grandfather purchased it after the war between the states in the late 80s. It was in a terrible state of disrepair. I believe there had even been a fire. He had to do a fair amount of rebuilding."
"And prior to that,"
said the writer, taking out his notebook and fountain pen,
"we've gotten the impression the original owner was less than a paradigm of virtue."
"Colonel Ralston. Oh, yes, they say he was a cruel man. Cruel to his slaves, anyway. And his wife, Margaret, is said to have been a shrew. Perhaps something worse." "Worse," said Houdini, leaning forward. Paul Langdon stood up and walked over to the fireplace. "The ownership of human beings rarely brings out the best in people. Just the reverse," he said, taking a drag on the cigarette. "Would even a kind, honorable gentleman such as yourself, Sir Arthur, not be tempted to exercise that power in a manner that brings out your baser qualities?"
"I beg you to be more specific."
"Weapons were dispensed fairly liberally, not unheard of in that time, I would imagine. But there were whispers of acts of true sadism, of a secret room where unthinkable atrocities were performed. Perhaps Mrs. Ralston went as far as murder. They say slaves were brought to the big house, as it was called, and were never heard of again. There was talk that the little woman in the house dabbled in all kinds of superstitious mumbo-jumbo, had a steady flow of visitors from Europe, professors and fortune-tellers and self-acclaimed necromancers. Oh, well, some housewives occupy their time with crochet, others paint watercolors.
Conan Doyle leaned forward in his seat, unable to disguise his excitement. Everything so far confirmed what the old caretaker Smalls had said.
What became of her? Houdini asked.
Oh, on her sickbed it said she confessed to awful things, having raised the devil, and opened a gate to hell itself, telling the doctors there were bodies of babies and sacrificed virgins in the house.
Good Lord! Sir Arthur blurted out. Young Langdon stilled him with a raised hand. Let me hasten to add, this was generally taken to be the product of delirium, particularly since a thorough search of the house confirmed there was not a tibia, funny bone, or poor Yorick to be found. The tea arrived, and as the guests sipped, their host continued. The house passed through a few owners, he said, tossing the remnants of the cigarette into the fireplace. It was difficult to retain servants, as you might suppose. You know how superstitious Negroes are by nature. They said the place was haunted by Mrs. Ralston's victims, or perhaps the wicked crone herself, and refused to cross the threshold. One owner even ended up hiring a staff of Chinese. Grandfather bought the house and gave it to my father as a wedding present soon after I was born. My father remodeled it to fit the needs of a modern family. It's of a modern family. It's of a modern family. It's of a modern family.
Chapter 8 continued.
In the years you lived there, did you see or hear anything that suggested the supernatural? Houdini asked. Any disappearances? The young man shook his head. Well, my dog vanished when I was 8 years old, if that counts.
Disappeared? Surely a dog running away is not so uncommon.
I always felt Buster would come back, Langdon said, his gaiety departing for the first time. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I could swear I heard him whimpering, near and yet far off. A child's imagination plays such tricks.
Conan Doyle repressed a shudder at the thought of a hound barking plaintively from some dark dimension.
Paul took a bottle from a cabinet and poured himself a glass of whiskey.
He offered the bottle to his guest, but both men shook their heads.
"Tisk, tisk, you don't know what you're missing, gentlemen," he drawled. "This is genuine Virginia moonshine, not the watered-down piss those Yankee bootleggers in Chicago peddle. We consider ourselves exempt from prohibition in this household."
It was obvious to Sir Arthur, from the way the young man gulped the whiskey, that, regardless of his cavalier manner, talking about the house upset him. "Apart from the dog," the author prodded him.
"I suppose one could say I had a rather idyllic childhood," Paul went on. "Fishing at the lake with grandfather, playing with my dear cousin Donald, who summered with me. Dad was fond of the theater, and he and Mama often participated in the community theater group he headed. He wrote and directed little plays for myself and Donnie and the housekeeper's daughter, Daisy. Taught us quite a bit about acting, really. We'd make ourselves up as old folks, Indians and the like. We learned from Dad how to do accents. We did a whole skit about leprechauns set in Ireland." "And yet?" Houdini asked. Langdon hesitated, frowning. He took another big gulp of whiskey. "I don't want to sound like some kind of hysterical ingenue," he said, "but have you ever sensed that a place was bad? Toxic? When I was there, I would always feel a deep sense of melancholy. One would feel drained. I was quite relieved to leave the place as a youth."
"There are places that drain mental energy, that are like vampires.
Is Count Dracula involved in this crime, Mr. Holmes?" A raspy voice came from the doorway. They turned and saw an old man in a wheelchair with a blanket across his knees, being wheeled in by a nurse. "Grandfather, dear, I thought you were sleeping," said Paul.
"Oh, I wouldn't miss this powwow for the world," said the elderly man, at least 80,
with yellow skin that hung in wrinkled folds like that of a hairless sphinx cat. "I am Randolph Langdon. You're Mr. Conan Doyle, and you're that magician. Here to be spoon-fed hogwash about that house, to hear ghost stories?" "Well, yes, sir," said Houdini, rising respectfully. "We were asking whether anything unusual happened in the house." "Other than that my daughter-in-law committed suicide?" Conan Doyle almost spat out his tea. "Indeed. Hanged herself from a chandelier in the library."
"Oh, my. That must have been an awful shock to you, young man."
Paul nodded grimly. He chugged the remainder of his whiskey and poured another glass. His ironic manner ebbed. "It was a difficult time. I was just 13, and Father didn't help by going completely mad." Randolph Langdon took over. "My son George, the most respected architect in the state, came running out of that house babbling about evil and monster."
"That must have been quite dreadful,"
Conan Doyle said. Asked Houdini, "Where is he now, if we may ask?" "For the last 18 years, he's been in a sanatorium near Norfolk." What had George Langdon beheld that fractured his mind, wondered Conan Doyle, that turned an energetic man who played make-believe with his children into a demented wreck?
"I should very much like to speak with him,"
Sir Arthur said. Young Langdon hesitated. "My father's mind is so fragile, I wouldn't want to see you overly upset him." His grandfather wheeled up to the young engineer and took his hand. "His mind is already shattered. You can't damage what's utterly broken." Houdini cradled the tips of his fingers thoughtfully. "Did your family make any alterations to the house?" "When I first bought the house, I had to restore part of it that burned in the Civil War. Later, my son knocked out a wall to expand the living room and such stuff," the grandfather said. "And when Paul returned from college, he had some renovations made so it could be run as an inn. Ha! That harebrained idea didn't work out so well. Even before the work was complete, a pair of Negro laborers vanished." "Yeah, we heard about that," Houdini said. "And don't forget Cousin Donald, who went missing 10 years ago," said Paul. "Some believe he ran off with Daisy, who jumped out of sight about the same time." "Horse manure. They were childhood friends, that's all. Idle gossip."
"The house swallows people like some kind of brick behemoth,"
Sir Arthur thought grimly.
"I'm tired," old Randolph Langdon said. "Call the nurse. Let her put me to bed."
"Yes, Grandpa," said Paul. He pulled a rope and a bell chimed, summoning the nurse. The old man wheeled up to the two visitors. "So you really believe there's something supernatural in that house?"
"We suspect so,"
said Sir Arthur. The patriarch grunted, and the nurse pushed him out. As soon as the old man was out of sight, Paul clapped his hands. The continuous imbibing of the whiskey had clearly taken its toll. His flamboyant manner was more pronounced now. "Well, that was all a bit morbid. Harry, you promised me a demonstration." "Of course," the magician said, rising to his feet. Paul went to a bureau and produced from a drawer a pair of large metal handcuffs. "Voila," he said with a smile. "When you told me you were coming, I ran out to the locksmith. He assured me they're the finest available. Naturally, I'm sure as the famous handcuff king, you've worked with cuffs far more challenging." Houdini smiled and extended his hands. With an amiable grin, Paul secured the handcuffs on Houdini's wrists. The magician turned to face the fireplace, hit them on the mantel, and they snapped open. He handed them back to the young man. Paul laughed and clapped his hands. "Splendid!" he cried. "Could you show me?" Obligingly, Houdini placed the cuffs on Paul's hands. "You see? Just hit them from this angle on a hard surface, and they'll bust open like walnuts." Sure enough, when Paul tried it, the cuffs snapped open. "Well, I have a little trick to show the police if I'm ever carted off by the authorities."
"Mr. Langdon, it's growing late, and we do not wish to trouble you any longer."
"Wait," Paul said. "I've something a little more challenging for you, Harry." He rummaged through a cabinet and produced a pair of huge, rusted old manacles that looked as if they'd been used to restrain a gargantuan slave in the past, and perhaps had been. The magician looked at them uneasily. He'd studied virtually every handcuff and lock made, but this was unfamiliar. "Of course, if you'd prefer not to," said Paul with a coy smile. "No, it's only that I've never seen one of those before, except in old drawings. Oh, well, I'll give it the old college try." Houdini extended his wrists. "Behind, if you don't mind." Houdini turned his back, and the young man slipped the heavy manacles on Houdini's wrists. Paul stood back and took a look at his handiwork. "I heard that once you escaped from a safe." "More than once." "I have a brand new one in my office, if you're up to it."
"Now, see here, Langdon. We really must be on our way."
"It's all right," Houdini said calmly. "I'm game. The young man's been so helpful." Paul grinned and led them to a study with an ornate wooden desk and a moose head over the mantel. In the corner was a 6-foot-tall black safe, as ominous in appearance as it was monolithic. Houdini whistled. "It's a beauty."
"It's certainly large enough to accommodate a bundle of loot. Bridges must pay exceedingly well these days, Paul."
"That's okay," said the escape artist. "It'll give me a little more elbow room to move around. Open her up." "Would you mind?" the young man said. Houdini turned his back as Paul opened the combination lock and swung the door open. As Houdini approached the safe, he glanced at the complex locking mechanism. He frowned in concern as he stepped in, Conan Doyle noticed. Had his friend really bitten off more than he could chew this time? "Now, I'll try my best," Houdini said as he turned to face them. "I hope you won't be disappointed if I can't get out. I've never seen this particular kind of safe before. It may take some time." "I'll be patient," Paul assured him, taking another slug of whiskey. The door slammed shut behind the magician. Paul lit a cigarette and offered one to Sir Arthur, who shook his head. "It's the latest model from the Yale Company," the young engineer informed him. "In the interest of full disclosure, I had it delivered yesterday when I learned Houdini was coming." The wealthy young man was beginning to irritate Sir Arthur. He found the way he waved the cigarette about as he spoke effeminate. "You don't suppose he'll have any difficulty, do you? I must confess one other item. I cheated a bit. I had the locksmith fill the keyhole to those handcuffs with lead." "The impudent little cad," Sir Arthur thought. He had half a mind to pop him in the nose and smack that self-satisfied smirk off his face.
"Now see here, young fellow, it's not quite sporting to change the rules as you go along."
Paul put his ear to the door. "Are you all right in there, Harry?"
"Yes, just having a bit of trouble with these cuffs,"
the magician replied, his voice muffled.
"This may take a while."
Paul retrieved a wine bottle from a cabinet. "We have some rather silly laws in America now concerning alcohol. Forgive me if I can't offer the quality of liquor you're accustomed to, but this sherry is quite charming. Perhaps you prefer it to whiskey, Sir Arthur? Or is it Doctor?"
"Mister would suffice, and I shouldn't mind."
As Paul poured him a glass, the writer took note of the vintage.
"An 85, a very good year, as I recall,"
Sir Arthur said blithely. Despite his casual manner, the truth was he was growing more concerned about his companion by the minute, but he refused to give this fop the satisfaction of knowing that. There came a loud thump from inside the safe, accompanied by a grunt.
"Blast it!"
Conan Doyle said, unable to restrain himself.
"It wasn't gentlemanly of you to plug those handcuffs. Houdini's stage challenges always involve regulation handcuffs, not some contraption from the Dark Ages, or, as you might put it, those romantic days of yore.
Paul took a puff on his cigarette and smiled. It would certainly make a good story if the great Houdini met his Waterloo in my house.
This is hardly a fair contest. We came here as your guests. I shouldn't expect you to crow about it to your friends at the country club.
I wouldn't dream of it. No, of course, it would be our little secret that he failed.
If he fails.
Chapter 9. The Mouth of Madness. The forbidding wrought-iron gates to the Culverford Sanitarium stood nearly 20 feet tall. Well, that ought to keep the giraffes in, Houdini said.
All that's missing is a cheery abandon all hope, ye who enter here,
Sir Arthur returned. He was, it seemed to Houdini, uncharacteristically glum. A clerk admitted them and escorted the famous visitors to the director's office. The walls bore the unpleasant green hue of regurgitated pea soup, with patches faded in places like the spotty memories of its denizens. Voices muttering, cackling, sobbing echoed through the dismal halls. The smell of urine was ever present. Orderlies led past them a young woman with unkempt hair that fell nearly to her knees. She stuck out her tongue and wagged it at them, leering in a full display of full-blown nymphomania. The author grew paler with every footstep, his friend observed. "I suppose you've never set foot in an asylum before, Sir Arthur," Houdini said casually.
"I've seen my share of delirium in men with enteric fever in the Boer War, and once, when I was a schoolboy, one of the prefects went stark raving mad. As they dragged him off the campus, he shouted my name 3 times. It seems a woman he fell in love with ran off with a man named Doyle."
Houdini smiled, picturing the tragicomic scene. The thought of Oscar Wilde languishing in such a place suddenly seemed less palatable to Sir Arthur. One could hardly imagine the legendary wit holding court among these wretched madmen. No, if he were sane when he arrived, he surely would be insane when he left. Better off in prison. They were ushered into the office of the director, Dr. Reginald Petersby, a long, thin man, pale as Stoker's vampire, with a dagger-like widow's peak and spectacles perched on his pinched nose. He greeted them enthusiastically, telling them the usual stuff about how he'd read every Sherlock Holmes story and had been astounded to see a newsreel in which Houdini, manacled, dived from a bridge into an icy river and surfaced free just minutes later. Flattered, Houdini struck up an animated conversation with the psychiatrist. Sir Arthur took an instant disliking to the man. The writer thought, "He projects an unnatural lack of normal human warmth."
"We wish to visit Mr. George Langdon," Conan Doyle said.
"I'm afraid that will be impossible."
"I assure you, this is a matter of the utmost importance."
"Why isn't it possible?" Houdini demanded. He figured this was one of those nut houses that didn't want visitors to see the wretched conditions in which patients were held. "It is impossible for the simple reason that Mr. Langdon is not here," Dr. Petersby replied. "He was transferred?" the magician said in surprise. Dr. Petersby squirmed with discomfort in his leather chair. "He escaped in February and has not yet been found."
"What?" exclaimed Sir Arthur. "Why was the family not informed?"
"Indeed, they were informed, by telegram, immediately after we learned of his disappearance."
"I can tell you with certainty they know nothing of the escape. We've only just come from the home of his father and son."
Dr. Petersby clapped his hand over his mouth. "Good heavens! The message must not have been received."
"Did you not find it odd that you received no reply? This really is quite ridiculous."
"Well, we've had so little contact from the family," Dr. Petersby said, beginning to perspire and patting his forehead with a handkerchief.
His father used to visit him once a year until he himself became infirm. His son, never once. I admit it was an oversight not to follow up."
Conan Doyle slammed his fist on the desk.
"An oversight! This is the most astonishingly gross case of incompetence and neglect I've ever seen. What kind of establishment are you running?"
Houdini placed a soothing hand on his friend's shoulder. "May we see Mr. Langdon's room?" Dr. Petersby, clearly taken aback by the author's sudden display of passion, nodded reluctantly. The small square cell was now occupied by a bookkeeper who'd suffered a nervous breakdown in the course of an especially complicated audit and was found gleefully turning a mountain of sales receipts into a bonfire. At the director's request, an orderly took the still skittish bean counter for a walk in the garden. Evidence of the previous occupant's presence was abundant. The walls were covered top to bottom with drawings, some in pen, and others crudely scratched into the paint.
"After we took away Mr. Langdon's pen, he used his fingernails,"
Dr. Petersby explained, adding sheepishly,
"We've been meaning to have the walls painted over, but we're short-staffed as of late. The current resident says that the artwork disturbs him, understandably. He says he hears sounds from it at night."
The drawings prominently featured a house with columns hemmed in by trees, unmistakably the Langdon house. It was rendered with a curious mix of architectural accuracy, with perfectly straight lines, and surreal distortions any cubist painter would envy. At the core of the house crouched a man boxed in by invisible walls that he pushed against like a mime. The front door was black as coal. Strange symbols, spirals, inverted crosses, pentagrams surrounded it. The gaping entrance drew one's attention with magnetic force. Sir Arthur found it took considerable effort to resist reaching for it. Words filled another wall, gibberish such as room, doom, rune, soon, and take me, lord and master. The word evil, in various sizes and lettering ranging from Gothic to garish block letters one would find in a crime tabloid, appeared 27 times by Houdini's count. Sir Arthur drew from his breast pocket the photograph of the spook house and compared it to the drawing.
"A good likeness, wouldn't you agree?" he said to Houdini.
The magician nodded and turned to the director. "Would it be possible to see Mr. Langdon's medical files?"
"I'm afraid I cannot oblige you." Dr. Petersby frowned. "It would be an egregious breach of the patient's privacy."
Sir Arthur looked about the small room. A monkey couldn't squeeze through the barred slit of a window.
"How the devil did he escape?"
"We have no idea. At the time he was in a corridor strapped to a restraining gurney, or as it is sometimes called, unfortunately, a crazy crib."
"Alone?"
Conan Doyle said, growing visibly angry again.
"He was strapped to the gurney for his own safety after lunging at an orderly. It was for no more than 15 minutes.
"May we see this hall?" Houdini asked. They were taken to the narrow corridor where Langdon had vanished. An orderly wheeled in the crazy crib upon which the madman had been confined. It was a formidable contraption with a dozen leather straps to hold in place the patient's arms, legs, chest, and head to a reinforced metal gurney. "Who strapped him in?" the escape artist asked.
"One of the orderlies."
"A reliable fellow? May we speak to him?"
"Oh, Casey? Well, he was with us only a short time. I fired him for drunkenness within a week of Langdon's escape. The sort who gives the Irish a bad name. But I assure you he was competent enough to strap a patient to a crib. Must have done it 50 times.
"A determined man could free himself," Houdini said, "and it wouldn't be hard to slip past your staff, who don't seem to be 100% on the ball."
"I sincerely doubt that,"
Dr. Petersby responded icily.
"The hallway was locked, in accordance with the regulations, and there were 2 other orderlies on the other side, having their morning coffee."
Houdini ignored him, already making note of a small window in the hall, through which a meager ray of light trickled in.
Once free of that crazy crib, all you'd have to do was jimmy that window, drop to the soft flower bed below, and scale the fence, he thought. How old is Langdon? About 52, as I recall, said Dr. Petersby. But the bed is inescapable, I assure you. It's been tested by a professional wrestler who weighed 350 pounds, and who relies on brute strength, Houdini interrupted him. Not a man who keeps his wits about him and has practiced self-extrication. Practiced? How? The director exclaimed, betraying a touch of annoyance. We run a hospital here, not a school for escape artists.
That's subject to debate, Conan Doyle said.
Houdini's theory seemed implausible on its face, but he couldn't resist needling this royal jackass.
You have no shortage of straitjackets here, I imagine.
Exactly, said Houdini, with growing excitement. He could have practiced getting them off and putting them back on. Was he ever treated for a dislocated shoulder?
A dislocated shoulder? I'll have to check the records, but why?
To get out of a straitjacket, you dislocate your shoulder. Dr. Petersby shook his head.
This is sheer nonsense. I doubt even you could get out of the device.
The administrator paused.
Could you?
Houdini flashed his signature enigmatic smile. You're not getting a free show out of me today, Doctor.
A wager, then. $15? The director said eagerly. I suppose that's not much to a man like you.
You're right about that, Houdini cut him off again. A more tempting offer would be this. If I failed to escape within 10 minutes, I'll perform for your patients once a year for charity. If I win, you let us have a peek at Mr. Langdon's files. Dr. Petersby wavered for a moment, mulling the deal, then peering down the open doorway to the next corridor, and seeing that the nurses outside were paying no heed, nodded. Chapter 9. Continued. The crazy crib looked as if it had been constructed to pin down the Frankenstein monster rather than a lunatic, but Houdini did not appear to be intimidated. At a leisurely pace he removed his coat, folded it neatly, and placed it on a chair. A pair of burly orderlies summoned by Dr. Petersby secured him to the gurney with a thick leather belt, which they buckled and tied to the sides of the crazy crib with short ropes. They strapped each ankle to the metal sides and then placed each wrist in a leather cuff. The duo folded his arms like a dead man in his casket, then ran a long slash cord through the wrist cuffs and tied it tightly to either side of the gurney. For good measure, the orderlies fastened down his neck with a leather strap that passed through the end of the crib. The expression of the orderlies as they performed this task was as brutish as any fairy-tale ogre's. They grinned gleefully at the magician's discomfort and occasional winces of pain. Houdini endured the manhandling without complaint, like a baby being changed and powdered, but he wondered if elderly patients and women got the same rough treatment. He'd heard lurid tales of what went on behind the walls of such asylums. It wasn't hard to imagine these apes beating uncooperative patients or taking advantage of women. Some years ago, that intrepid reporter Nellie Bly had, by going undercover as a madwoman, exposed such abuses. Dr. Petersby looked on with undiluted delight at the sight of the great magician trussed to the bed, utterly helpless.
"Can I watch?"
he said eagerly, adjusting his glasses for a better look.
No, and I must ask you to step outside in the hall," the magician replied. "Oh, and Sir Arthur, may I have a word with you?"
As the administrator withdrew reluctantly, the author bent and put his ear to the magician's lips. Houdini whispered, "In 5 minutes, find an excuse to tell that clown to take you back to his office." Conan Doyle hesitated to abandon his friend on that table, particularly after Paul Langdon's ungentlemanly mischief. If it were any comrade-in-arms other than Houdini, he would refuse to leave his side. He sighed and nodded. Then he went outside the room with the administrator, who used his keys to lock the hallway door behind him.
"These Jews can be bumptious, can't they?" Dr. Petersby commented. I've heard he's one. I admit I'll get a certain satisfaction from the look on his face when we walk into that room a few minutes from now and the bed has defeated him. It really can't be done, I assure you."
Sir Arthur grimaced. He had one or two other friends of the Hebrew persuasion, and, famously, had risked his reputation to free Oscar Slater, a German Jew wrongly convicted of murder. He didn't care much to hear them disparaged.
"I didn't mean to insult your friend, of course,"
the administrator hastened to add. He stepped closer to Conan Doyle and whispered confidentially,
"Tell me, has he ever revealed to you how he makes those marvelous escapes? Some I've read about completely confound me."
"He refuses to divulge his methods," replied Sir Arthur. "My own theory is that he has the power to dematerialize, to pass through a solid object such as a brick wall or out of handcuffs. He assures me he has no such ability, although it would be a grand gift to possess. Ah, if only he would share the truth with the world."
"Perhaps he is genuinely unconscious of the ability," suggested Dr. Petersby. "I'm a physician, yet I have to admit I've witnessed some things in this place that are quite perplexing. People who claim to have had past lives and can relate in great detail events from centuries ago. It's hard to be a complete materialist."
It irked Houdini that Dr. Petersby, while claiming to be an avid fan, had not read that escape from a crazy crib was very much a feat in his repertoire. There was none of the flimflammery involved in most of his other escapes. It depended solely on strength and dexterity, not concealed keys, locks, or knives. His early years as a circus contortionist endowed him with remarkable flexibility. In his opinion, this wasn't really a difficult escape at all. He once told an aspiring young magician interested in learning the trick, "If it's not sold with the right amount of fanfare, it stinks. Sold well, it's the cat's pajamas." The weakness of the crazy crib was that the wrists weren't actually fastened to the sides of the gurney, but only to the cord fastened to the crib. That allowed Houdini to slide his upper arm toward his neck. With his right arm on top and straining to the left, he worked his hand close to his head. Slipping it over his head was impossible because of the neck strap, but with a little effort he reached his neck and untied the strap holding it down. Once his neck was free, he had quite a bit more mobility. Shifting his body, he undid the bonds on the left side. Houdini was out of the crazy crib in under 4 minutes. The window was protected with a barred gate that was locked, but the master of escape was an expert in picking locks and kept a pick on his person for such impromptu challenges. He pulled it out of a small secret compartment in his belt and went to work. Sir Arthur consulted his pocket watch.
"My dear fellow, I left my hat in your office," he told Dr. Petersby. "Would you be so terribly kind as to allow me to retrieve it? I fear you'll be giving us both the heave-ho in a minute."
The administrator said to the thuggish orderlies,
"Keep an eye on the hallway door. Don't let anyone get near it. Mr. Houdini might have brought along Confederates."
They returned to the director's office. When Dr. Petersby opened the door, he gasped. There sat Houdini in the director's chair, with his feet propped up on the desk, puffing on one of the administrator's cigars. He was reading papers from a manila folder that bore the label George Langdon, patient number 528. Dr. Petersby reached for the file.
"See here."
Houdini held it away. "A bet is a bet, Doc." As they drove back toward Dunwood, Houdini wore a satisfied smile.
"Don't be so bloody smug," Sir Arthur cautioned him. "So you've proved it's possible. For you, yes, but for an amateur?"
Houdini wasn't fond of driving, but he made an exception because Conan Doyle, who by contrast adored being behind the wheel, was tired after so many hours back and forth. "Well, what gives?" he asked the author, who was busy scrutinizing the medical file.
"It describes the patient as obsessed with the house. Babbled about it quite incessantly, it seems. Well, Houdini, do you still deny there's something diabolical about the Langdon house?"
Well, let's not forget the guy was crazier than a bedbug.
You escaped from the gurney, but you are Houdini. That does not prove, by any stretch of the imagination, that an ordinary chap would be able to do the same.
An ordinary chap who's had years with nothing but time on his hands.
You don't honestly believe that?
Houdini tried to imagine the madman, wild-eyed and hallucinating, methodically freeing himself as he had. He had to admit the theory was far-fetched. Okay, what's the alternative?
That he has the very gift you claim you are without.
Sir Arthur, do you really believe Mr. Langdon used supernatural powers to escape from the asylum?
The mind of a madman may be irrational and yet gain a unique form of psychic energy, Conan Doyle pointed out, just as a man who has lost his faculties might have the strength of 10.
However he did it, a maniac on the loose puts a new slant on this case. If Langdon made his way back to the spook house, the scene of his mental breakdown, he might be responsible for the judge's disappearance.
Yet so many disappearances took place while he was incarcerated.
Unless he somehow escaped from the asylum and returned when it suited him. He seems to be somewhat of a
Houdini,
if you pardon the expression. They put it in the dictionary now, by the way, not to blow my own horn.
There's another explanation, of course, and I fear you may find it more outlandish than my theory that he projected himself out. You recall the drawing of the house, how it seemed to draw one in almost irresistibly?
What are you suggesting?
That whatever evil force resides in that house, it spirited him away.
As they drove back to Dunwood,
that whatever evil force resides in that house spirited him away.
As they drove back to Dunwood, fatigue swept over Houdini, and it took that strong will he bragged about not to drift off, as had the older man beside him. Images flooded his brain, Langdon's wild sketches of the house, those peculiar symbols. He thought, maybe Doyle is right. No ordinary man could have freed himself from the crazy crib. If Langdon vanished, it was not by his own doing. Something else is at work here.